A grandfather's last words can echo through a lifetime, shaping a family's future in ways they may never fully understand. For 50 years, the Miller family lived with one such echo, a cryptic and deeply strange final request. As the family patriarch lay on his deathbed, he made his son promise one thing. Promise me you'll never touch the living room floor. Through decades of creaking floorboards, family jokes, and endless speculation, they honored his wish. Now, in the winter of 2023, as his grandson, Michael, prepared to pry up the first wooden plank, his hands trembled. The 50-year waiting period was over. He had no idea what he would find, but he knew that what lay hidden beneath their feet was about to change everything they thought they knew about their quiet, hardworking grandfather. To understand the 50-year secret, you must first understand the man who created it, John Miller. John was the kind of farmer they don't make anymore, a man whose life was written in the soil of his land. For over 40 years, from the 1930s to the 1970s, he worked the fertile fields of his farm from before sunrise to long after sunset. His weathered hands, calloused and strong, knew the subtle language of the earth. He could crumble a handful of soil and know exactly when to plant, and he could read the clouds in the sky to predict the weather patterns that could make or break a season's crop. He was a quiet, thoughtful, and deeply respected man. But his wisdom was not just about farming. It was a wisdom forged in the fires of one of the most devastating economic disasters in modern history, the Great Depression. John had been a young man in the 1930s, and he had witnessed firsthand how the world could fall apart. He saw his neighbors, proud and hardworking farmers like himself, lose everything overnight. He saw banks, the institutions people had trusted with their life savings, simply close their doors, their vaults empty. He saw how paper, money, the very symbol of wealth and security, could become almost worthless, its value eroded by hyperinflation and economic collapse. This experience carved a deep and lasting lesson into John's soul. Trust in the tangible. Trust in the land you can stand on, the crops you can grow, and the assets you can hold in your hand. He developed a profound and lifelong distrust of banks, stock markets, and the fragile promises of paper currency. This quiet farmer, who spent his days working the soil, spent his evenings reading not just farming almanacs, but financial papers, studying the patterns of history and the cyclical nature of economies. He was a student of survival, determined to ensure his family would never again be at the mercy of a system he believed was destined to fail. Our story now jumps to the summer of 1973. The crops on the Miller farm were thriving, but inside the old farmhouse, a heavy atmosphere hung in the air. John, now an old man, lay in his bed, his long, hard life of labor finally catching up to him. He was surrounded by his family, including his devoted son Thomas. Everyone knew these would be his final days. As his strength faded, John called Thomas to his bedside. His voice was weak, but his eyes were filled with a sharp, intense clarity. He made his son make a promise, a request so specific and so strange that it would become the central mystery of their family's life for the next half-century. He made Thomas promise that the old wooden floor in the living room must remain untouched. They could renovate any other part of the house, paint the walls, fix the roof, modernize the kitchen, but that floor had to stay exactly as it was. And then came the most baffling part of the request. He made Thomas promise to wait exactly 50 years before ever considering replacing it. Thomas was puzzled. Why the floor? And why such a specific and incredibly long time frame, 50 years? It seemed like an eternity, but his father's gaze was so intense, so full of a meaning that Thomas couldn't yet understand, that he didn't dare question it. He simply nodded and gave his word. It was a sacred promise, a son's final vow to his dying father. After John's passing, life on the Miller farm continued. Thomas took over the operations, working the same fields his father had, determined to maintain his legacy. The seasons changed, crops were planted and harvested, and the old farmhouse witnessed it all. And the living room floor, it creaked and groaned beneath their feet, a constant, audible reminder of the strange promise. As the years rolled by, the floor showed increasing signs of wear. Thomas, true to his word, would never replace it. He would carefully repair a loose board here, fill a gap there, but the original floor remained. His wife often suggested a full renovation, pointing out how other families in the area were modernizing their old farmhouses. But Thomas would simply shake his head in reminder of his promise. The mystery of the floor became a family legend. Thomas's son, Michael, grew up with the story. As a child, he and his cousins would invent wild theories. Maybe their grandfather, a known prankster in his youth, had set up the world's longest practical joke. Or perhaps, as some whispered, he had grown senile in his final days. But Thomas never wavered. The promise was absolute. The floor witnessed Michael's birthdays, his first steps, family holidays, and countless Christmas mornings. It creaked under the weight of Christmas trees, supported furniture rearrangements, and bore silent witness to both celebrations and hardships. And through it all, the question remained, what made this ordinary, increasingly worn-out wooden floor so special? By the year 2020, the old farmhouse was showing its age. Thomas, now in his 70s, had suffered a stroke and had to move into a nursing home. The full responsibility for the farm and the crumbling old house fell to his son, Michael. The financial pressures were immense. The roof needed work, the windows were drafty, and the plumbing was a constant source of problems. But it was the living room floor that concerned Michael the most. Every step now brought a chorus of loud creaks, and certain boards had developed an ominous, dangerous sag. The decision weighed heavily on him. Pour a fortune he didn't have into endless renovations, or sell the property his family had farmed for generations. As Michael sat at the kitchen table in the winter of 2023, calculating the spiraling repair costs, something suddenly struck him with the force of a revelation. He counted the years on his fingers. It had been exactly 50 years since his grandfather had passed away. The mysterious half-century waiting period was finally over. That same evening, Michael found himself alone in the quiet, historic living room, the weight of his family's past and future resting squarely on his shoulders. The old floorboards groaned under his feet, but for the first time, the sound was not an annoyance. It was an invitation, a whisper from the past. He studied the floor with a new, intense focus. In the fading evening light, something he had never noticed before caught his eye. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference in the grain pattern of one specific board near the old stone hearth. It was a slight variance in the wood's texture, a detail so small it would be invisible to anyone not actively searching for an anomaly. Michael's heart began to race. Was this the spot? Was he about to solve a mystery that had been a central part of his life since childhood? With a surge of adrenaline, he went to the barn and returned with a flashlight, a hammer, and a crowbar. His hands trembled as he knelt on the floor and worked the thin, flat edge of the crowbar under the side of the suspicious board. The old wood resisted at first, held fast by the nails that had been in place for generations. He applied more pressure. The wood groaned in protest, and then, with a sharp, splintering crack, the board suddenly gave way. He pulled it up and set it aside. He shone his flashlight into the dark, narrow cavity below. It was not empty. The beam of his flashlight revealed a hollow space between the floor joists, and nestled within that space were several small, tightly packed burlap sacks. With shaking hands, Michael reached down and lifted out the first sack. It felt surprisingly heavy, solid, and it made a soft, metallic clinking sound. His mind raced with possibilities. He fumbled with the old drawstring at the top of the sack. As he loosened it and tipped the contents onto the floor, a cascade of gold coins spilled out, glinting and shimmering in the bright beam of his flashlight. He stared, speechless. There were dozens of them, from different eras, all made of pure, heavy gold. He opened the next sack and the next. They were all full of gold coins. It was a small fortune, a pirate's treasure, hidden not on a deserted island, but right under the floor of his family's living room. But the coins weren't the only thing he found. Tucked carefully among the sacks was a thick, sealed envelope, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. Written on the front in his grandfather's familiar, steady handwriting was a single word, Michael, with tears now welling in his eyes. He carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, a final message from his grandfather, John Miller, written just before he passed away in 1973. The letter explained everything. John, having lived through the utter devastation of the Great Depression, had learned a hard lesson about the nature of money. He explained that he had spent years, from the 1940s through the early 1970s, secretly and methodically converting small portions of the farm's profits into gold coins. He knew, with a farmer's certainty, that while the value of paper money would be slowly but surely eroded by inflation over time, the intrinsic value of gold would hold steady and likely increase, acting as a perfect hedge against the future. And then came the answer to the greatest mystery of all, the 50-year waiting period. It hadn't been an arbitrary number or a sign of old age. It had been a brilliant and carefully calculated economic forecast. John wrote that he had studied historical economic patterns and inflation rates. He predicted that the slow, steady creep of inflation over the next half-century would make the cost of living, and especially the cost of maintaining an old house and farm, rise exponentially. He calculated that by the year 2023, the value of his modest collection of gold coins, when measured in dollars, would have multiplied in value many times over, providing a substantial sum of money precisely when his future grandson would likely need it most. The 50-year instruction wasn't a strange request. It was a carefully planned, long-term financial strategy. A gift of security that he had planted, like a seed, knowing it would only be ready to harvest decades after he was gone. He wanted to ensure his family would have the resources to save the farmhouse he had worked so hard to build and to secure the farm for the next generation. When Michael had the coins professionally appraised, his grandfather's incredible foresight became clear. What would have been a significant but relatively modest sum of money in 1973 had indeed, after 50 years of inflation and the rising price of gold, become a small fortune. There was more than enough money to not only completely renovate the old farmhouse, restoring it to its former glory, but also to modernize much of the farm's aging equipment, securing its future for years to come. The next day, Michael went to the nursing home to visit his father, Thomas. He brought with him the letter and one of the heavy gold coins. As he told the story, memories flooded back to his elderly father. Thomas wept as he finally understood. He remembered his own father, John, staying up late at night, not with farming books, but with financial papers and charts spread out on the kitchen table. He remembered overheard conversations about inflation and economic cycles that he had dismissed as just one of his father's eccentric hobbies. And he remembered the serious, intense look in John's eyes when he had made him promise to wait 50 years. It hadn't been a test of obedience. It had been an act of profound love and protection. The creaking floorboards that had been the subject of so many family discussions and jokes had been protecting more than just gold. They had been guarding a grandfather's love, his wisdom, and his unwavering determination to provide for his family's future long after he was gone.